But I'd like to introduce you to our next speaker now. She is at the forefront of dealing with issues facing young women. Adrienne Peltz is the president of the National Union of Students and the Union of Students in Ireland, and as such represents around 200,000 college and university students across Northern Ireland. Under her leadership, the NUS-USI has successfully lobbied to keep the education and maintenance allowance for 16 to 19-year-olds. And Adrienne is also keen to address the imbalances student parents face and has direct experience as a single mother herself.
Hi everybody, goodness me, it's not often that I get to be speaking to a room full of feminists about women's issues. I mean, well, at least where I'm invited to and people actually appreciate it. I mean, I talk about these things all the time, but the men don't usually appreciate it. Anyway, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I'm going to chat to you a little bit about some of the barriers faced by women in both further and higher education, and some of the barriers that they face after education. And I'm going to pepper it with some of my life experiences, because having listened to everyone else, I'm sure that you don't want to listen to me talking about statistics and repeating myself, so I'll add a little bit of anecdotal stuff in. So as most of you can tell, this is not a Belfast accent. I'm actually from South Africa, and that in itself gives me an interesting perspective on education, because I kind of grew up in an environment where most women are not given the opportunities to succeed and to achieve. Higher education is extremely expensive in South Africa. There is no such thing as a student loan in the country either, and the majority of women, particularly from disadvantaged areas, will never see the inside of a high school, never mind a college or a university. So I suppose that's where I'm coming from, and it's incredibly important for me to be able to talk about the education experiences of women in Northern Ireland. Being from South Africa, centuries and centuries ago, in pre-Islam North Africa, it was actually quite common practice for families who had young daughters to take those daughters out and to throw them into pits and cover them with soil and bury their daughters, because at the time it was considered that a young girl child was actually a burden on the family, and young girls were they didn't have an economic benefit to the family. Of course, this practice is, discontinued, and, we love our girl children, and we do the best that we can, most cases, to give them the opportunities in life. But actually, I would argue that in 2013, the kind of things that we have to put up with as young women in particular haven't really changed from the practices in North Africa, where young women were thrown into a hole and had the opportunities taken away from them. And some of the stuff I'm going to talk to you about today kind of illustrates that. So what do we know? We know that education is a cycle. We know that there's the advice, the information and guidance that young women and, of course, boys receive before they go into higher education or further education. And that obviously preempts their education choices. And we've all been on the receiving end of some bad advice at one point or another, and I think one of the key things is that sometimes young women don't receive the right kind of advice about the education choices that they have available to them. And then there is, of course, the time that they spend in education, in primary schools and high schools, in further education and within our universities. And of course, those experiences can be very different across the range of educational provision. And then there are the post-education choices, where you go to work, whether or not you do a master's, or whether or not you do a PhD, whether or not there's even funding available to do these things, particularly for women. And then there, of course, is employment. And some of our previous speakers today have really highlighted the gap between the employment opportunities available for women and those available for men. And more importantly, the actual pay gap that women are forced to live with across Northern Ireland in particular. So really, the way I see it is that it's a bit of a race to the bottom. And what we do know about the barriers that young women face is that, yes, many young women outperform boys at primary school. And this is obviously a statistic that a lot of schools are very keen to, to make very public that young girls are continuously outperforming boys. But what they don't tell us is that young girls who are on free school meals are the ones that don't outperform the boys, and they are the ones that don't tend to go on into further and higher education. And I see that as an area that the government is failing drastically those young girls who already come from socially deprived backgrounds, those young girls who are probably caught in a horrendous poverty trap themselves with parents, mothers, often single mothers, who just haven't had the life experience and the life chances and opportunities to go on and create financially stable environments for their children. And those young girls then get caught into the trap and don't land up going into either colleges or universities. So what happens to them? They become the economically inactive. The phrase, which frankly, I'd quite like to ban that phrase, for good, because I think that it completely discredits the kind of people who are stuck in the cycle of poverty. And I think, I know I'm preaching to the converted here in this room, but if that's one thing that we could all kind of leave with today, it's knowing that the language that we use is actually so disempowering for these young women. When we talk about being economically inactive, you immediately put a barrier up with the language that we use when we talk about these things. So you have the girls who are coming from a free school meal background, who are underperforming, not going into education and not going into training or employment. Those girls flounder. They have their benefits taken away from them. They're often put onto work schemes where they have to work for free just to claim their benefits, in places like pound stretchers where they're on apprenticeships, but actually all they're doing is mopping floors and stacking shelves. And I don't know about you, but I know how I would feel if my main purpose in 8 hours of a day was to mop a floor and be shouted at by customers and by senior management who didn't really value you because they weren't even paying you. So I think that there's a huge gap there, and if we could leave here today and go back into our respective professions and start talking honestly about the kind of opportunities that these women in particular, these young girls often, are facing, that would be brilliant. I hope you bear with me. I've had to cut this down dramatically. So we know that these young girls are really struggling, and we know that they're having all of their life chances taken away from them. And one of the things that we're told all of the time is that there's an absolute lack of women in senior leadership roles in both universities, colleges, and schools who can be role models for these women. And in fact, the UCU, the main trade union for colleges and for universities, recently did a little bit of research into this. And at the current rate, they've recognised that it would take almost 40 years for the proportion of female professors to match the number of women staff in lower level positions. We know that the official figures show that women make up actually 47% of university staffing. That is 76,000 women working in our universities. How many of those are professors? Only 20%. Only 3,500 women ever actually get to break the glass ceiling in our academic institutions. I don't know about you, but I don't think that that's good enough. And standing here in this building, which was built for women to go into education and study to better themselves, I just don't think that it's acceptable that in 2013 we still have a dearth of women at the top in our education environments who are not being able to reach out to young women and encourage them to continue on in the professions, particularly in the academic professions. The research has also got some information, of course, through the Freedom of Information Act, from 23 universities who found that 4 times as many men actually applied for professional posts as women. So what does that tell us? Women just don't want to put themselves forward? No. Women don't feel capable of putting themselves forward for these academic positions. Because one of the key criteria for becoming a professor is the amount, and I don't know, do we have any professors in the room? No? Okay. Oh, one, right. I'm sure you can empathise, but one of the key things that becoming a professor takes is that you have to be peer-reviewed and you have to have credible research, which requires hours and hours and hours of intense labour, which women, particularly with caring responsibilities, just cannot cope with. It becomes incredibly impossible, and I would argue that that is a structural barrier that women, particularly in the academics, have to face on a daily basis, where men are promoted because, of course, in many instances, they have a wife who is able to take care of the child responsibilities. But these women, who are intellectual and incredibly talented, will never rise to the top. And as the research shows, 40 years is just too long for it to take to get a kind of gender equality within our institutions. But those are just some of the issues that are happening in our actual academic institutions. I think it's more important for me to talk to you a little bit more about, once you get into education as a woman, what happens. Well, if you're from a relatively well-off background, actually as a woman you'll do quite well until you go into employment. But we'll come to that later. If you are a woman from a vulnerable demographic, like a student parent, I was a student parent myself. I was a low-paid carer before I went into education, and it was incredibly difficult for me to even get the courage to go to a college and say, I would like to better myself. And I had a man sitting across the table from me, and this is no reflection on men in general, but he said to me, and my dear, how are you going to study when you are a full-time carer for a child? And I think that kind of guidance and advice is so incredibly dangerous for women who are already feeling vulnerable, to be told at the gate that you can't actually come in. How many women had had a similar conversation with that lecturer that I spoke to and been discouraged from the advice that he had given me and the comment that he had made? Because it took a lot of willpower for me to actually challenge him and say, well, actually, this is something that I really, really want to do, and if I don't do this, I'm going to spend the rest of my life on a minimum wage, not being able to ever take my daughter on a holiday. But that's just my story, and I know that there are thousands of women across Northern Ireland who are in a similar predicament of all ages, regardless of whether they're single mothers who are 18 years old looking to get into education because the system has let them down, or women in their 40s and their 50s who often are having to care for their own grandchildren, never mind their current children, but their grandchildren as well, because we have a situation in Northern Ireland where informal childcaring almost outstrips the formal childcaring because of the sheer cost that what young women have to pay in order to go to work and have their children looked after. We know that women who have got caring responsibilities for disabled relatives are probably one of the biggest losers in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland's got a particularly high percentage of women carers who do look after disabled family members and relatives. And one of the things that I'm working on at the moment with the National Union of Students is actually how we tackle this and how we support those kind of students. Because there is a huge flaw in the student support system which says that if you are a carer of anybody over the age of 18, the minute you enter education, you lose every single bit of funding that you would have had prior to education, and suddenly you have to become completely reliant on the student loan that you get, which is a meagre £3,000 a year, in order to support yourself and to support the person who you are caring for and who is vulnerable. And we know that it is mainly women who fall into this category. If there's anybody here from the Department of Employment and Learning, A, answer my emails, and B, let's have a chat about what we can do to kind of rectify this, because it is a huge gap in the care and the duty of care that we have to ensure that women in particular who have these kind of responsibilities are being given the best opportunities possible, and that they're being financially supported by a government which, you know, doesn't seem to really have the welfare of the people at the heart. The National Union of Students has also recently done a huge piece of research into the financial experiences of students across the UK. We called it the pound in your pocket. You know, obviously, because we'd all like a bit of a pound in our pocket. We researched and spoke to 14,000 students across the UK, and it's actually the biggest piece of research ever done on the experiences of students in third-level education. And it was quite interesting, some of the things that we found, just in relation to women. There were obviously specific issues around women who have caring responsibilities, and a lot of the people here today have already touched on the extreme amount of pressure that these women have to face, and the sheer lack of finance that these women have to deal with on a daily basis. But what was interesting was that of the respondents, we found that male students were actually twice as likely to be receiving support from businesses or from their own employers compared to women students. So for every one woman being sponsored by their employer, there were two men being sponsored. Clearly, employers are not valuing the opportunity of investing in their women employees and sending them to university. Clearly, men are being able to utilize their networks far better than what women are able to. We also found that actually women are more likely to work while studying. I'm sure that comes as no surprise, particularly if you've been a student in the last 10 years. It's very, very tough out there. But the sad thing is that most of these women will also work for a far lower wage than their male counterparts as students. We also found that women students indicated far lower well-being across most of the questions asked in the survey. In particular, more than half of the women who responded indicated that they regularly worried about not having enough money to meet their basic living expenses. Their basic living expenses. That's not the expense of going out on a Friday night, because I suppose if you look at the bars, over Christmas, there weren't even that many people going out. This is about meeting the expense of feeding themselves and often feeding their families. But that's just the educational barriers. What about the barriers that women face on our campuses? And it's something that we haven't spoken about yet today, and that's the kind of sexual discrimination that women have to put up with on a regular basis. We don't often talk about this as students because it's kind of like the last taboo in the lad culture that we live in, where women are continually harassed on campuses, and it has a huge impact on our educational experiences. We've recently done research, which I'm happy to kind of send out to everyone because it's something we're incredibly proud of, and it shows the impact of having page 3 and the impact of having lad culture on campuses. But more worryingly, the research that we did around violence against women on campuses was staggering, in that we found that 1 in 7 of the survey respondents had actually experienced serious physical or sexual assault during their time as a student. That is a staggering amount. 1 in 7 students being on the receiving end of serious violence. 12% have been stalked while at university or college. And 68% of the respondents have been a victim of one or more kinds of sexual harassment on campus during their time as a student. Now, you might ask me, what's the correlation between educational barriers and this kind of sexual harassment and discrimination? Well, if you add it all up, there are a lot of women right now on campuses who are being attacked, who are being discriminated against, and who are being harassed by their fellow students. And the impact of that is that those women will drop out of university or change courses. And that is something that we have to own up to, and that is something that our organisation has to own up to as well, and educational institutions need to recognise that there is a serious impact on young women who are being discriminated against and harassed on campuses. We have a duty of care to go out and protect those women on our campuses. We're responding by offering zero tolerance training to different student unions and to universities to educate them about the kind of experiences these women are having, because what we should never allow is a woman to leave university or college because she's been mistreated by a fellow student and sexually harassed. Even more worrying is the number of professors who are the ones carrying out these awful, heinous things. I could talk to you about PhD students and the plight that they have in terms of having to work on a one-to-one basis with lecturers, where often the relationship will break down, and women PhD students are significantly disadvantaged because of these kind of breakdowns in relationships. Women PhD students will 9 times out of 10 receive lower marks in the STEM subjects, because we know that people think that that is a male-orientated career and will 9 times out of 10 mark male students much higher than they would mark the identical paper for a female student. Which brings me neatly onto the subject of STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and maths. That's a little picture of a little girl. As I've said before, I'm a mum. I've got a 7-year-old daughter, and actually she is a huge lover of science. She got a microscope for her birthday 2 weeks ago, and she hasn't stopped torturing me about looking at pieces of strands of hair and all kinds of interesting things, and she eats science books for breakfast. She can tell you all of the planets in the solar system, and in fact, 2 days ago, I overheard her saying to one of her friends who had said something about a cat being very human-like. My daughter said, well, actually, genetically, they're very different. So not only is she a little bit precocious, but I think that, you know, she's got a real affinity towards science. And that's my daughter, and that could be anybody's daughter in this room. In fact, I'm sure it is many of your girl children. You know, they really have a desire and a passion for science and for learning and for technology. But what do they face in the real world as young children? Where did all the women go? Because when we get to science, technology, engineering, and maths, suddenly we realize that it isn't a level playing field for students and for our graduates. We know that women in the UK are incredibly underrepresented in the STEM sectors, and it's actually been 37 years since the passing of the Sex Discrimination Act, but yet we still have this huge gap and this huge imbalance. We know that the engineering workforce only comprises 4% of women technicians and only 6% of women engineers. And actually, the percentage of women who have been employed in IT and telecoms has declined from 22% in 2001 to only 18% in 2010. And fewer than 1 in 5 applicants to the technical apprenticeship service for scientific roles are female. So you can see over here on the slide that if you look at GCSE levels, female participation in the STEM subjects is 50%. So half of our girls are fully engaged with science, and they enjoy it, and they're actually really, really good at it. What I haven't included is the fact that they do actually outperform boys. Not only are they more interested, but they also outperform boys in the same subject. And then we move on to A-levels, and it starts to taper off just a little bit, with only 42% remaining engaged with the science subjects. And then when we get to undergraduate level, it becomes a little bit more worrying, because only 33% of women are studying sciences at university. And then the shocking bit comes when you get to the part where we actually leave university and we try and go and get jobs in the sciences. And only 12% of the workforce in the sciences is made up of women. So fewer girls and fewer women are studying STEM subjects at university level, and even less of them are getting employed. More than 2/3 of working-age women in the UK with a STEM degree don't even work in the STEM fields. So where are we losing these women? Where are these women who are so incredibly talented and so dedicated in the years up until undergraduate and during? Where are we losing them? A recent evaluation of project pilots to increase the diversity of apprenticeships found that young women, parents, and often teachers and advisors held very outdated and outmoded views of STEM occupations. Employers tended to feel that there were few barriers on the supply side, but rather that there was a limited demand amongst young women, which I think is ludicrous, because I definitely don't think that there is less of a demand from young women graduates to work in the sciences. The pilot schemes, however, weren't convinced that all employers had considered the unconscious bias in recruitment practices and work environments. And this was something that was very key to me when I was recently at a graduate recruitment fair. And of course, there was a plethora of all the big name companies with their stands talking to students. However, working those stands were men in suits. Now, as a woman myself, and I consider myself to be a fairly strong woman, I'm sure other people would say that I'm a bit more than strong, strong-headed, strong-willed. I was intimidated to go and talk to these men because here they were, professional men in suits, ignoring the women in the room and only reaching out and talking to people who looked like them. I mean, the plight of women who are from an ethnic minority background is even 10 times worse because those women are completely underrepresented. But if we look at women as a whole, in the room, it was 90% men, and they were getting 90% of the attention. When I had a conversation with one of the engineers from one of the recruitment companies, they told me women don't like to do these things. Women just don't want to get their hands dirty. And of course, my response was, I don't think science is about getting your hands dirty. I think that's quite counterproductive, actually. I'm sure there's laws against that. But this is the perception that we're having to deal with on a daily basis, where employers and recruiters don't see women as a viable option. The evidence also shows that girls at school age are discouraged from taking up STEM subjects from primary school onwards. And the failure of the education system means that there's actually a smaller pool of talent for businesses who need far more people with STEM skills. And it also means, importantly, that women are actually excluded from commanding higher earning jobs. And for those women who do obtain STEM qualifications, the culture and practices of traditionally male-orientated working environments is actually often a major deterrent on its own, and it affects recruitment and, more importantly, the retention of these women graduates. And the overall impact of the dearth of women in STEM occupations is that the UK industry, as we've heard today from various speakers, doesn't benefit from the additional innovation, return on equity, and profit that a diverse workforce actually offers. And if we put that into the Northern Ireland context, what becomes more worrying is the fact that 51% of places at university are actually for STEM subjects. You can do the maths. Half of our subjects are going towards STEM, but only 33% of our women students are actually applying for these undergraduate subjects, and only 12% of them are being employed. So if we're talking about who's getting a fair share, I definitely don't think that women are getting a fair share, and women students are certainly not getting a fair share when it comes to sciences. We know that the Northern Ireland Programme for Government has also committed millions of pounds towards investing in the sciences. Again, I have to ask, who is getting the fair share? Because it certainly cannot be women when only 12% of them are benefiting from that investment. From developing sustainable modes of transport, to harnessing sustainable energy, to agriculture and finding cures for bovine tuberculosis. These are all areas that women could be excelling in, but yet they're just not able to get there. And in the midst of this, government is slashing funds for student nurses. They are, as we've recently seen, attempting to get rid of the education and maintenance allowance, and also deprioritising areas such as social care and NVQs for home carers, which we know are predominantly held by women students. So it kind of feels, for me, as an advocate for students, that we are constantly fighting in a man's world, because all the investment that the government seems to be putting forward seems to be going to people who benefit from being a man. Now, I think that, it's quite a lot to take in, and it does sound quite, disheartening when you think about the situation that women are in. But I do think that there are a lot of things that we can do in this room and outside of this room. So what can you do? What can we do? What can I do? If you are a parent and you haven't heard of feminist parenting, I urge you to go and have a look at feminist parenting. If you have a girl child, please convince them and encourage them, and make sure that you are telling them how great they are, because we know that young girls suffer from feeling self-conscious, and they suffer from confidence issues. Make sure that you are investing in those young girls and telling them they're good at sciences and telling them that they are good at maths. Tell your schools, if you are a parent and you're involved with your PTA or your school, tell your headmaster that you want the curriculum liberated. And when we talk about liberating the curriculum, what does that mean? That means that we stop talking about just Isaac Newton and Einstein, and we talk about some of the other amazing women scientists that existed in this world. I've got a few lists here, and I was going to do a stand-up, sit-down exercise with you, but I don't know how that's going to go down well, so I'll leave that one out. But I would just ask, how many of you recognize the name Augusta Ada King? Does anybody recognize that name? One person. King. That's my accent. I'm ruining it there. She was actually hailed as the first programmer. She was born 200 years ago, and she actually invented the entire code that the binary code is based on. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, as a feminist and somebody who's incredibly interested in education, I'd never heard of her until 2 months ago when I was at an event similar to this, and people were talking about it. But yet we all know who invented the internet, and we all know who Steve Jobs was. But we don't know who Augusta was. History has consigned her to a dank, musty pile of books somewhere. May Carol Jemison, she was the first African-American woman to travel into space. That's a huge thing. That is an incredibly important step for women. But yet our girls don't know about these things because they're never taught this at school. So again, I'll reiterate that if you are involved with your governing bodies at school, or if you're involved in any school activities, talk to your headmasters and tell them that you want to see your school's curriculum liberated to include more information about women from the sciences and women role models. You can write to the Department of Employment and Learning and tell them that you want to see far more women on governing bodies of colleges and universities. Because at the moment in Northern Ireland, we have one female principal in a college, and that's Belfast Met. And I applaud the principal of Belfast Met because she is in a man's world having to continually fight against oppression. I would ask that you respond to consultations from a woman's perspective and make sure that you are always arguing the case for childcare and investment. And the final thing that I'll say to you, which is probably a little bit cheesy and a bit touchy-feely, but the biggest thing that you could ever do for anybody, I want you to think of one woman that you know. She might be younger than you, she might be older than you, but a woman that you know. Have you got anyone in your head? I know who I'm thinking of. Think of a woman that you know and think about how you can reach out to them. Because as we know, women in public life are not represented. I can count on my hand the number of female MLAs that I have been able to have regular contact with and lobby, because there just are not enough. I can count on my hand the number of chief executives who are women who have engaged with our organisation, because again, there are just not enough of them. And I can count on my hand the number of senior civil servants who work in higher education and work in education in general, who we would engage with. So because there is a huge lack of women representation, you have a duty to go out and represent women and to take women along on the journey with you. So think of that person, that young woman that you have in your life, and what you can do to help them along the journey and pull them up the ladder with you. Because unless more women like us in this room, and of course the men, I'm not forgetting the men, you have a huge role to play in this too. But unless more people like us start extending a hand out to other women to pull them up the ladder, we will never be able to correct the imbalances that we have. If you're sitting on an interview panel, please always think about the women graduates who are crying out to be given a chance to work in sciences, to become academics. Please always think about the women in the room who are more quiet because they probably have massive responsibilities at home, and that doesn't mean that they're shirking their responsibilities and they can't work late because they have a gym class. It's usually because they have parenting responsibilities. And give those women a chance. Thank you.